Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our bi-weekly series. I'm Roman Lysecki, CTO and co-founder for BG Networks.
And I'm Eric Pettis, Medical Device Cybersecurity Services Lead for BG Networks.
And in the past set of weeks, we've been looking at some of the details regarding what the FDA requires as part of their submission. And we'd like to switch our focus a little bit and actually start to do sort of a series going through a threat and risk assessment for an example medical device and get into some of the details, more of the nuance behind that, and use a common example from a MITRE playbook, and which is the AMPS, the ankle monitor predictor of strokes example. Well, we've talked about this before when we've discussed our ITHRA threat and risk assessment tool as an example to use, and we want to go a little bit further into the detail of doing that. So I wanted to set the context here before we got into the news, because one of the relevant aspects of the news article we have today relates to the first task you would want to do as part of a threat risk assessment, which is identifying your relevant assets. In terms of the news, I'll again highlight some of the recent CISA alerts that have come out. And a very recent one, it was actually late February where this was released, but it's very relevant to the conversation here. There was the Dario Health USB blood glucose monitor. So this is a small device that can connect up to an Android phone, an Android application that allows you to take measurements from your test strips and log those inside an app. There were a series of vulnerabilities found against this. That the ones that I think are really relevant are related to the cloud interface. And I think this is commonly when you think of a connected device, like the cloud is a big component of that. So the two that surprised me a little bit, one surprised me, which was not using encrypted communication with the cloud. So it's HTTP traffic, not secure encrypted communication. So they're revealing personal health information as part of that. The other one that's a little bit more nuanced and often not thought about is their cloud infrastructure itself, that they were exposing the policies they had set in their cloud infrastructure would allow someone to look at the internal structures. Their development environment details were revealed because they didn't lock down their cloud infrastructure sufficiently. Eric, what are your thoughts on sort of how holistic somebody needs to be in terms of doing a threat and risk assessment, in terms of identifying the assets that are critical to think about and lock down?
Well, I think the identification of assets needs to be reasonably comprehensive, and maybe starting, with some simple architectural views or diagrams to understand the system and everything that's involved. You really do need to determine all the assets in order for the threat and risk assessment to be comprehensive enough.
And I think the common ones that are very easy to identify, and we'll spend some time thinking through what they are, is it's the device itself. Like, there's the device. There's the firmware that runs on the device. You have a mobile phone app that you're utilizing. These are your common hardware and software elements. But in order to do a more holistic understanding of the assets, I think there are other assets that are important to think about. Even the people who are using your system should be identified.
Absolutely, including interoperability.
Exactly. So that interoperability would be the interfaces that it needs to communicate, what it's connecting to. And I think the categories that are usually top of mind, easy to think about for assets, I think there are 8 of them, the way I would categorize them. You have hardware, software, those are kind of pretty well known. You're going to look at the operating system that you're running things on top of, which is also important. Data, a pretty straightforward one to think about. And then I think you get into the more nuanced ones. From a security standpoint, any keys, cryptographic keys, encryption keys, authentication keys, code signing keys, all of those should be considered as part of your assets. And then, as you mentioned, the users, and then cloud resources. And I would say sort of new to the party is AI and ML. That if you're using any level of AI ML as part of training models, doing diagnostic, any component of that, you have to, I think, give that a special consideration. Colin, welcome.
Hey guys.
Glad you could join.
Thank you. Thank you. Roman, so those were good categories that you were talking about for the assets there. And I think the assets need to be anything that is security related, either can be impacted or potentially could be something you want to have a security control related to. Would you say that's a reasonable high level definition for what should be considered in terms of assets?
Yeah, I would expand it as well to think about the assets involved that might lead to a threat or a compromise. And so, for example, users are one of those that I think in our daily lives you'll see phishing attempts, social engineering attempts that are trying to compromise people's accounts or passwords. And that's one of the entry points into the system. So knowing who your users are, who your developers are, those are all assets because they can be the entry point where a compromised account gives somebody administrative access that's their first step into the system. So thinking of also the attack paths or what the threats would be against.
Yeah, it's a great point, Roman. I mean, phishing attacks, where through, as they say, social engineering, lead to somebody giving up a password or causing somebody to click on a bad QR code. Going back to Signalgate, which we had talked about previously, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, had warned against a social engineering attack on Signal, where there were malicious QR codes being sent around by Russian APTs, and they tried to get you to essentially take a photo or click on the QR code, so to speak, and that would add their device. It's a nice feature in Signal where it makes it easy to add your other devices, your phone or your PC. Yeah, but absolutely, you have to think about the social engineering aspects of things.
And I think it's the data as well. Everywhere from the sensor that's taking a measurement that leads to some PHI or some diagnostic determination a clinician might do, or some data a clinician is doing to make a diagnosis. That whole chain, anywhere it exists and it's stored or it's processed, should be considered there. So your assets will start with the hardware sensors to one perspective. Like that's where the physical measurement is taken. That's the kind of one of the first things you might be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting too in the 8 security control categories that the FDA outlines in their September 2023 guidance. Under the confidentiality section, there's certainly data, but they make a kind of an interesting point also where they talk about keeping the keys or the key data, so to speak, confidential is so important. Like you said, Roman, in a medical device, if a data for a diagnostic device is affected, that might be the worst case safety scenario for some kind of diagnostic device. If it is something that is providing a cyber physical kind of effect, where it's a infusion pump or something, and the patient's physical well-being is being impacted, I mean, that is even worse, in terms of if the data gets compromised in the device. But keeping keys secure, that data protected, is a little bit unique, and it's an asset that has to be thought of very specifically. And I don't know if everybody thinks about, their certificates in their device or the keys, private keys, as being an asset that needs to be considered. But that has the impact of multi-patient harm. If keys can be compromised, that leads somehow to accessibility for the attackers to multiple medical devices. It's not only one person whose diagnostic data, is being affected. It could be many, many people.
Absolutely. So if we look at the concrete case then, or I guess the fictitious example where we can talk about some of the assets and why they should or shouldn't be considered assets, we have the ankle monitor predictor of strokes from the MITRE playbook for threat modeling medical devices. So just have a little bit of context there. That device it's fictitious, but it assumes you have a ankle worn sensor, a proprietary sensor that can predict strokes, but also some additional sensors for measuring heart rate and body temperature. It can communicate over Bluetooth to a phone application. That application collects the data from the ankle monitor device and communicates that to a cloud, where it's primarily the data is stored in the cloud, such that a physician could at a later time access a cloud-based web portal, look at the patient's data to help make a diagnosis of what's happening. So you have three main components: sensor, phone app, cloud infrastructure. That cloud infrastructure includes data stores along with a web portal for clinical access. So if we're looking for all of those, as we've done sort of some threat and risk assessment on that as part of our examples, and there's about 41 different assets, roughly, depending how you count that. And again, we could start with the hardware level. So this always comes to a question of, is it an asset or not? So one of those is the device has a USB port. It's a USB-C port. Is that an asset that we should care about from a cybersecurity standpoint?
I'm going to say yes. I don't know what you think, Eric.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I
Do
think
we, do we get a prize, Roman, for getting the answer correct?
No, so this was an interesting one to bring up. And the reason I bring this one up is in this example device, that USB-C port is only used for charging the battery. There's no data communication happening over that device. The fact that it's a USB port, regardless of how it was implemented, you should absolutely consider it an asset, because you should consider the threats against it, and then you should make sure you've actually disconnected your data lines and they're not hooked up to some internal USB-C lines as part of your device. So you can make the assumption if it's not supposed to have the data lines connected, but you got to verify it's connected. So I think any of those ports, if it's USB, it's an asset.
Yeah, if it can be, even if it isn't, you have to identify why it's not a threat. So it has to be there.
And USB is interesting too in general, Roman, even when the data lines are connected, because it's not considered a traditional network interface, but it is definitely part of the attack surface.
It's often how you plug in a flash drive to do a firmware update, and so many different use cases for USB, and it's just so easily accessible. If it has an intended purpose, it just has to be there. You have to be physically there, but then there's still a lot of attack surfaces assuming you have the physical access.
Yeah, and I think USB is tricky for people. I'm glad you brought this up, because it's not thought in those ways traditionally, whether as a network port or, like you said, people aren't necessarily thinking about a secure software update. And if that's used as the interface, you definitely need to consider it. And I also think that people don't immediately go to, hey, if the USB port's active, I could connect a Wi-Fi dongle. And now all of a sudden the device is networked, and maybe that becomes kind of a persistent interface for an attacker if it's unknown that something's been plugged into the device, and then maybe it's a wide open path then for the attacker to get in because it wasn't considered. So.
Mhm.
So here's some other the hardware assets that would absolutely be, I think they're not controversial, but there's a few more that may be on the border here that we can talk about
Okay.
as well.
What do you got
So
for us?
you have the sensors. The sensors absolutely are assets. The proprietary stroke predicting sensor, it's an asset. The heart rate monitor sensor, asset. Body temperature sensor, definitely asset. Like I think those are clearly should be in the bucket of being assets. But you also have things like the battery, the lithium ion battery, or the on-off switch, the physical on-off switch of the device. Should we consider those assets for doing a cybersecurity threat and risk assessment?
Are you testing us again?
No, I think this gets into a gray area, and it's a matter of opinion. I have a particular approach I would advocate for, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I do think you could, depending on how it's used, make a case either way.
Eric, why don't you go first? Because I'll use your answer to make my answer better.
Sure. I just think of denial of service, so I mean, it's not like you're in an operating room and you have a shelf of 5 additional identical medical devices that you can grab if your medical device doesn't operate. I doubt someone having this on their ankle has 3 or 4 around the corner. So battery goes dead, the device doesn't work, right? If the switch breaks or can be tampered with and it's switched off, the device doesn't work. So it's a denial of service. It's not like the device is life-saving. Yes, it's going to collect data. The patient isn't relying upon the device to treat a disease, so they'll be fine. So the risk would be very, very low. I guess that would be my take.
I think that's a good answer. I'm going with Eric's answer, Roman.
I think it's a good answer as well. The battery, we've seen examples of vulnerabilities where rapid battery depletion was part of a recall that the FDA had put out for implantable pacemakers, that the attack could lead to that. And so not considering that denial of service as it relates to the battery itself, I think would be a disservice. So I would include it absolutely. For the on-off switch, it might depend if it's like literally a switch that you just physically turn, because that's a physical attack. But most switches now on devices are software controlled. Like they're not, it's not like you do an actual light switch. You press and hold down a button, which is actually the software measuring the switch saying, hey, is someone pushing down the button? Okay, I'm going to turn on my interface. So they're actually, a lot of these so-called physical switches are actually software controlled. And it's a little bit more complicated story.
Yeah, it's a great point, Roman. And I think, with this denial of service question too, the context of use here is important, right? And Eric, like you said, if it's this ankle monitor predictor of stroke, the context is it's gathering data over an extended period of time, over months. So if the thing breaks for a few days, the risk is going to be low. You get another one, maybe it's a week. You can start, going again, assuming that the denial of service isn't persistent. But if it is this other case, it's a pacemaker, and the battery can be, drained in a pacemaker. That's a serious safety situation.
Yeah, and very invasive. I mean, uber risk. It's just that's a bad thing to happen.
Yeah. So here's an asset, a battery, that the risk associated with it is completely different based on context of use.
Absolutely.
In terms of a different category for assets, which sometimes have things you should consider as well that aren't specific, that aren't easily identified, is data. So some data is easy to track. Sensor data, absolutely. Any user information, PII, could just be their name, address, their home Wi-Fi password, whatever's necessary. That's data. It's kind of easy to understand. What are the other you guys have thoughts on different data that may not commonly be thought about in terms of doing a threat and risk assessment?
I was hoping for multiple choice questions, Roman.
What?
This is a fill in the blank. I'm not prepared for this one.
Absolutely.
Eric, why don't you go first again? Okay. So different types of data other than personal information?
Other than PII and PHI.
Yeah. Well, there's the data itself of what the monitor is measuring and pushing up to the cloud. I think that's most important.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Roman, configuration data of the device. So if there's data on the device that affects the way the device operates, who has access, it could be related to authorization policy data. These things are also, important. So data isn't just what the results of the test are. Data could also be related to the functionality of the device.
Absolutely. And configuration data, as an example of that, could be as simple as a threshold that generates a notification.
That's another one. Yeah.
That might be configurable at a system level where you've deployed the same threshold across all your devices, or it could be a threshold specific to an individual user. And again, that's data you should be considering as well. I think the data that would be a little bit less common that you may not be thinking about are your logs. That if you're logging diagnostic data to see if a device is working correctly or not, that's data that's relevant from a cybersecurity aspect as well. That could be system logs. That could be in the cloud. You might have audits of who's accessed what data. So if you have a cloud-based resource, if you're logging user access to data or login attempts, that again is a security relevant thing you should be considering as well.
Yeah, 100%, Roman. And I think the attackers, try to cover the tracks by tampering with the logs and, having a way to make sure the logs are authenticated or can be detected for tampering. Is another thing. So here's a security asset, right? Well, we have logs to track security of the device. Well, geez, the security asset needs to have security.
And this is a great point, because if you start with an initial design and you're doing a threat and risk assessment, you're going to define security requirements. You may need a key to sign your code as part of a security requirement. You might have, I need an audit log, and now I'm producing this additional data. Now that you've added those, they're assets again, and you have to consider the threats against them. So a threat and risk, it's not a linear process. You don't just start and stop at the end. You might generate new assets as part of implementing those controls. And now you got to pick that up and redo your threat and risk assessment because you have these new assets defined.
Yeah, 100%, Roman, 100%. So we're saying data, and there's various types of data. We're saying, I don't know if we mentioned code, right? But code's a sort of data, but you treat that differently, right? That has to be.
You mentioned software, yes. Software, though, I think is the easiest one for people to identify, especially if you're doing an SBOM. You know the software that you have. That's not the granularity you want in a threat and risk assessment. You want a little bit higher of your main pieces of software, not individual libraries, but absolutely. That one's easier, I think, for most people to.
That's right. And then things like security logs and keys. Also, those are things that you want to make sure whatever the device is they're considered assets.
And then users. So in the case of the AMPS example, you have the patient who's wearing the actual device, and you have the clinician who's logging in to access those data. So you have those as the users for that system. Another element that is maybe not in your control, but as part of the system, is the operating system. So it is software.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Every device you're running on has an operating system. And if you can't just pretend operating system vulnerabilities don't exist, they do. And so you should consider those threats. So for every component, what operating system does it run on? You should have an understanding of that.
That's right. And you can easily see, like the example of Windows. Windows has a bug. that absolutely could lead to a threat. So it, needs to be an asset that's considered.
Mhm.
Hey, Roman, we're coming to the end of the time here. What else do you have in terms of assets that should be considered?
We've covered most of the categories here. A key material, we've talked about it in the AMPS example, and this tied back to the news article. I think you missed that, Colin, but it was about a vulnerability of one of the components was a cloud connection that did not have a encrypted communication, so it just used HTTP for communicating.
Okay.
But if you're using a secure communication to your cloud, you also should be considering the certificates you're using to establish that connection. So your TLS certificates, if you're doing any device identification, X509 certificate for your devices, those are assets as well. Most web interfaces, where you may not be thinking about it, depending upon your expertise, is most web-based sites, when you log in, they utilize tokens, API tokens, or authentication tokens for gaining access. You don't have to log in every single time you want to refresh the page. You do it once and it maintains a session. Those are tokens that you should be considering. There's many threats that have targeted those types of assets for cybersecurity. So you start to get into needing an understanding of some of your cloud components and understanding how that communication works. So you're identifying the keys that are required. And then, of course, key materials. Any password that's involved as part of the code deployment, cloud infrastructure configuring, user login for your account, those all need to be considered as well.
That's great, Roman. I think, Roman, we're just about out of time. What's next? Are we talking about threats in a couple of weeks?
Yes, we will. And so at a high level, we talked about assets today as being the starting point, and the series that we would go through to have a systematic approach is asset identification. We'll then look at the threats and threat scenarios against those assets. We'll look at the damages that might result from those threats and the impacts that they could have, particularly on patient safety. The attack paths on how might I actually attack a system. What's the potential path that would lead to that damage scenario? Evaluate the exploitability of that path, and then combine the impacts and the exploitability into a risk assessment and define mitigations. So that would be the overall process that we'll follow.
That's great, Roman. That's great. I think those are going to be interesting topics, and we'll provide practical advice as we go. So any last thoughts, guys, before we sign off?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed watching Colin squirm today, because normally he's the MC, and it was great to have Roman challenge him. So that was exciting.
Roman did a great job.
He did.
And, yes, it was a little bit of a slow start here today, but I think it turned out okay. So
Yeah, because it always
Well,
does.
that's great.
Always great having a conversation around this.
Great job, guys. Thanks, and thanks everyone.